So let's take a look at homework exercise 17. And in this exercise, we have a number of syllogisms to test, and also at the end, a few items where your task is to generate the missing premise. So in the first section, for each of the following items, determine if the argument is valid or not. If invalid, identify as many fallacies as you can find. And if identifying unequal distribution, specify which end term commits the fallacy. So this portion of exercise 17 is identical to exercise 16, just to give you more practice in applying the rules of inference for syllogisms. Then in the bottom section, a few items testing your ability to generate missing premises from natural language arguments. And indeed, you'll have another opportunity to do some more missing premise work on exercise 18. So we'll go to the syllogisms first and look at number 1. Some elementary texts are marketable books. Some marketable books are not sold used. And some elementary texts are sold used. So we begin noting that we have a particular affirmative first premise, a particular negative second premise, and a particular affirmative conclusion. And if we look at the distribution scheme, of course, with particular affirmatives, we have no distributed terms. In the particular negative, the predicate term sold used here is distributed, and in the conclusion again, no distributed terms. And so one thing we can do is note right away that we have an affirmative conclusion, but we also have a negative premise. So we have the fallacy of unequal negation, because the number of negative premises does not equal the number of negative conclusions. We can then look at the middle term. The middle term here is marketable books, and we note that that middle term is not distributed at all. So we also have maldistributed middle, because middle terms must be distributed once and only once. And then we can look at the end terms. We have elementary texts, which is not distributed in the conclusion and not distributed in the first premise. And that's fine because they are equally distributed. But then we look at sold used, which is not distributed in the conclusion, but it is distributed in the second premise because it's a predicate of a negative. And so we also have unequal distribution of the end term sold used. So we have 3 fallacies in number 1. Number 2, no revolutionaries are good statesmen. Thomas Paine was not a good statesman, therefore Thomas Paine was a revolutionary. So the first thing we note, of course, is that both the second premise and the conclusion refer to individuals in the subject term, so those are going to be universal statements. The second premise will be a universal negative, and the conclusion will be a universal affirmative. You also have a universal negative first premise, and when we look at the distribution in those statements, of course, universal negative gives us 2 distributed terms. Both the subject term and the predicate term are distributed. That would be true in the first premise and also in the second premise. And in the conclusion, it's a universal affirmative, so the subject term would be distributed, but the predicate term would not be distributed. So because we have 2 negative premises, we know right away it is also unequal negation, because the number of negative premises cannot equal the number of negative conclusions. Good statesman is our middle term here, and good statesman is distributed in the second premise because it's predicate of a negative, and also distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of a negative, and that means it's distributed twice. That's maldistributed middle, because middle terms must be distributed once and only once. Then we have the end term Thomas Paine, and both times Thomas Paine is the subject of a universal, so it's distributed twice. That means it's equally distributed, and that's fine. But then we have revolutionary, and revolutionary is not distributed in the conclusion, but it is distributed in the first premise as subject of a universal. So we have unequal distribution of the end term revolutionary. And so again, 3 fallacies with number 2. Number 3, some businesses are small enterprises. Some businesses are not thriving operations, and therefore some small enterprises are not thriving operations. So we start with a particular affirmative premise followed by a particular negative premise and a particular negative conclusion. So the distributed terms here would be the predicates of the 2 negative statements. So thriving operations is distributed in the second premise, and thriving operations is distributed in the conclusion, and none of the other terms are distributed. So we have a negative conclusion and 1 negative premise, so we're okay by the rule of equal negation. And then we can look at the middle term, which is businesses. We find the middle term, it's in both premises, but not in the conclusion. And in this case, we have businesses not distributed in the first premise and not distributed in the second premise, and that's maldistributed middle, because middle terms must be distributed once and only once. Then we can look at the end terms, and small enterprises is not distributed in the conclusion. It's subject of a particular, and it's also not distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of an affirmative, and that's equal, so that's okay. Then we have thriving operations, and both times thriving operations occurs as predicate of a negative, so that's also distributed twice. That's equal, and that's okay, but the syllogism is still invalid because of the fallacy of maldistributed middle. Now we can look at number 4. No reporters are allowed in the courtroom. Cuthbert is not a reporter, and therefore Cuthbert is allowed in the courtroom. So in this case, again, we have both a second premise and a conclusion, which has an individual as the subject term that makes these statements universal statements. So we have a universal negative second premise and a universal affirmative conclusion. The first premise is also universal negative. In universal negatives, of course, we have 2 distributed terms. Both the subject term and the predicate term are distributed. So that would be true of the first premise and of the second premise. And then in the conclusion, as a universal affirmative, the subject term is distributed because subjects of universals are distributed, but the predicate term is not because predicates of negatives are distributed, but this is an affirmative. And so then we can apply the rules of inference, and we note right away that we have 2 negative premises, and that tells us that we have unequal negation because we have an affirmative conclusion, but the number of negative premises must equal the number of negative conclusions. The middle term here is reporters, and reporters is distributed in the first premise because it's subject of a universal. It's also distributed in the second premise because it's predicate of a negative, and that's maldistributed middle because middle terms must be distributed once and only once. Then we have the end term Cuthbert. Cuthbert is both times the subject of a universal, so it is both times distributed, and that's equal, but people allowed in the courtroom is not distributed in the conclusion, but it is distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of a negative, which means we also then have unequal distribution of the end term people allowed in the courtroom. So 3 fallacies with number 4. Number 5. All codfish are low-fat and delicious. No lake fish are low-fat and delicious. Therefore, no lake fish are codfish. So we have a universal affirmative first premise, a universal negative second premise, and a universal negative conclusion. In the universal affirmative, the subject term codfish is distributed, but the predicate term low-fat and delicious fish is not distributed. And then in the two universal negatives, both terms are distributed. So with that in mind, we can apply the rules of inference. We have one negative conclusion and one negative premise. So by the rule of equal negation, this is fine. Then we can look at the middle term, which is low-fat and delicious fish. And low-fat and delicious fish is not distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of an affirmative, but it is distributed in the second premise because it's predicate of a negative. And for middle terms, that's fine. You want a middle term that's distributed once and only once. Then we can look at the end terms, and we have lake fish distributed twice, both times as the subject of a universal. And then we have codfish also distributed twice. In the first premise, it's subject of a universal, and in the conclusion, it's predicate of a negative. And so this passes all three of the tests of validity, all three of the rules of inference. It is then a valid syllogism. Number 6. No European Catholic immigrants were 19th century urban elites. No 19th century urban elites were Democrats, and therefore all poor European Catholic immigrants were Democrats. So in this instance, we have a universal negative first premise, a universal negative second premise, and a universal affirmative conclusion. In the universal negative statements, all the terms or both the terms are distributed. And in the universal affirmative, the subject term is distributed. So we have two negative premises, and that tells us right away, of course, we have unequal negation because the number of negative premises must equal the number of negative conclusions, and you cannot have two conclusions. So we have the fallacy of unequal negation. Then we can look at the middle term, which is 19th century urban elites. It appears in both premises, but not in the conclusion. It is distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of a negative, and it is distributed again in the second premise because it is subject of a universal, and that's maldistributed middle because it's distributed twice, and middle terms must be distributed once and only once. Then we can look at the end terms in the conclusion. Poor European Catholic immigrants is distributed in the conclusion as the subject of a universal, and also distributed in the first premise as subject of a universal, and that's fine. But then we look at Democrats, which is not distributed in the conclusion because it's predicate of an affirmative, but it is distributed in the second premise because it's predicate of a negative. And so that's unequal distribution of the end term Democrats. Number 7, all California raisins are good singers. Some good singers are also good dancers. Some California raisins are also good dancers. Now this might seem like an archaic reference, but there used to be a commercial for raisins where the California raisins sang the tune, Heard It Through the Grapevine. So maybe I'll show you that old advertisement at the end of this homework review. In any case, we have a universal affirmative first premise, a particular affirmative second premise, and a particular affirmative conclusion. In the universal affirmative statement, the subject term is distributed, but the predicate term is not. And in the particular affirmative statements, neither term is distributed. So we have 3 affirmative statements, so we avoid unequal negation, but we look at the middle term, and the middle term is good singers, and good singers is not distributed at all, and that's maldistributed middle, because middle terms must be distributed once and only once. Then we can look at the end term California raisins. California Raisins is not distributed in the conclusion because it's subject of a particular, but it is distributed in the first premise because it's subject of a universal. So that's unequal distribution of the end term, which I'll abbreviate here as UDET, but unequal distribution of the end term California Raisins. And then we can look at the other end term, good dancers, and good dancers is not distributed in the conclusion because it's predicate of an affirmative, and it's not distributed in the second premise because it's also predicate of an affirmative, and that's okay, but the syllogism is still invalid because it commits the fallacy of the maldistributed middle term and the fallacy of the unequal distribution of the end term California Raisins. Then number 8, some hostile aliens are not humanoid. All humanoids are rational beings, and then some rational beings are not hostile aliens. So in this case, we have a particular negative first premise, a universal affirmative second premise, and a particular negative conclusion. In particular negatives, the predicate term is distributed. And in universal affirmatives, the subject term is distributed. So as we look at this, we have a negative conclusion and one negative premise. So we avoid the fallacy of unequal negation because the number of negative premises equals the number of negative conclusions. The middle term is humanoid. We find that in both premises but not in the conclusion. But humanoid is distributed twice. In the first premise, it's the predicate of a negative, and in the second premise, it's the subject of a universal. So that's the fallacy of the maldistributed middle term. And then we can look at the end terms, and we have the end term rational beings not distributed in the conclusion because it is subject of a particular, and not distributed in the second premise because it's predicate of an affirmative. That's equal, and that's fine. But then we look at hostile aliens, and hostile aliens is distributed in the conclusion because it's predicate of a negative, but it is not distributed in the first premise where it's subject of a particular. So that's unequal distribution of the end term hostile aliens. So those are the 8 syllogism examples applying the rules of inference to test their validity. So then let's take a look at the missing premise items. And the objective here is to discover the missing premise in the following arguments, and be sure that you translate the argument into standard logical form and that your missing premise allows you to construct a valid argument. Okay? So number 1, some faculty will not participate in union action and therefore will not be invited to the union picnic. So here we have an argument in natural language, but we want to pay attention first to the 2 statements and figure out which statement is the evidence statement and which is the claim. The clue here is the word therefore, the argument indicator, which tells us the second statement is the claim or what will become the conclusion in the syllogism, which means that the first statement is the evidence statement, or in other words, the premise in the syllogism. And as it turns out, the premise here is almost already in standard logical form, so we could start with that, and we would put it as some faculty, and we see it's negative, are not, and we'll call it union action participants. So that's the given premise, and we don't know what the missing premise is yet, but then we have a conclusion, will not be invited to the union picnic. Who will not? Well, the same faculty we're talking about. So some faculty are not, and we'll call that union picnic invitees. Okay. So now the question is, what's that missing premise? What goes in the middle here to connect the first premise or given premise to the conclusion that we've generated? So we look at this and we find, first of all, that we have a negative premise and a negative conclusion, which means the missing premise must be an affirmative statement. And we know that because we cannot have two negative premises. So to avoid unequal negation, we have to have an affirmative statement. Then we can turn to the middle term, and we know that the middle term is union action participants. We know that because it is not in the conclusion here. So it's the term that appears in the premise but does not appear in the conclusion. So this middle term is distributed. We know it's distributed because it's predicate of a negative. And the rule for middle terms is middle terms must be distributed once and only once. So we'll make that bold to show it's distributed. Middle terms must be distributed once and only once. And this is distributed here, which means when it reappears, it cannot be distributed. Now we know this is an affirmative statement, and we know that predicates of affirmatives are not distributed. So we'll move this down to the predicate position and insert it here, union action participants, because then we will know that that middle term would not be distributed in the second premise, which means the middle term is distributed once in the first premise, and then it follows the rules for middle distribution. We then turn to the end terms. Faculty already appears twice, and it's not distributed in the first premise and not distributed in the conclusion, and that's equal. So our other end term is union picnic invitees. It's the term that appears in the conclusion, but it's missing in the second premise. So I know it's the missing term, and it is distributed in the conclusion because it's predicate of a negative. So we'll bold that to show that it's distributed. But if it's distributed in the conclusion, it must also be distributed in the missing premise because it has to be equally distributed. And so I know this is an affirmative statement, and that tells me then that it must also be a universal affirmative, because with universal affirmatives, I can get a distributed subject term. So we'll make this into all union picnic invitees are union action participants. And that gives us a valid syllogism with the missing premise: all union picnic invitees are union action participants. Now let's move to number 2. There has never been a day in March above 70 degrees. It follows that no apple blossoms have ever appeared in March. Okay? So we see these two natural language sentences, which give us two natural language statements. We also have the argument indicator. It follows that. And it follows that tells us this is going to be the claim of the argument, or in other words, the conclusion of the syllogism. And that means that this statement over here is the evidence statement, or in other words, the premise of the conclusion. So let's start there. And as we do, we note that we have the sentence or statement, there has never been a day in March above 70 degrees. How do we translate that into standard logical form? Never tells us this is going to be a universal negative. So we would say no March days, because our universe of discourse is days. So no March days are 70-degree days. And that's probably not true, but in this case we'll say it is for the sake of making the syllogism. No March days are 70-degree days. And then the conclusion is, it follows that no apple blossom days are March days. Okay? And we'll bracket those to make clear what the subject and the predicate term are. So now we generate the missing premise. We notice that we have two universal negatives. So in order to avoid the unequal negation, we have to again have an affirmative missing premise. And then we can look for the middle term, and the middle term is 70-degree days. We know that because it's not in the conclusion. And the middle term is distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of a negative. And so again, we would drop this down and make it the predicate of the affirmative, because I know predicates of affirmatives are not distributed, and that avoids maldistributed middle. Okay? So we have a middle term, 70-degree days, that is distributed in the first premise but not distributed in the missing or second premise, and that's fine. Middle terms must be distributed once and only once. March days, the end term, appears twice already, and in the conclusion it is distributed as subject, as predicate of a negative, and in the first premise it is distributed as subject of a universal. So both times it's distributed, and that's equal, so it follows the rule. Now, apple blossom days is the missing end term. We know it's there in the conclusion, and it is distributed, which means it must also be distributed in the missing premise. And that tells us once more that this is going to be another universal affirmative statement. It would be all apple blossom days are 70-degree days. And then I have apple blossoms distributed twice, both times as subjects of a universal. And so this syllogism now passes all the rules and is valid. And we've generated the missing premise, all apple blossom days are 70-degree days. Then we go to the third one. And then we go to the third example. Then we go to the third example. A few of the professor's books are not about rhetoric. Consequently, at least some of his books are boring to read. Okay? So we have two statements. Which statement is the conclusion, or which is the claim in natural language that will become the conclusion in the syllogism? Here's the clue, the argument indicator consequently, and that tells us this is going to be the conclusion of the syllogism. At least some of his books are boring to read. That means over here we have the evidence statement, which becomes the premise in the syllogism. A few of the professor's books are not about rhetoric. Okay? So we can start there, and we'll say a few, which is some, and we'll call it professor books are not, and we'll call them rhetoric books. So a particular negative, and then consequently, at least some of his books are boring to read. So some, again, particular, some, his books, which means professor books, are boring books, right? Put the brackets on that. Now, perhaps you've noticed right away we've created unequal negation. So we have a particular negative premise, but a particular affirmative conclusion. And if we just kept it that way, we would commit the fallacy of unequal negation, because the number of negative premises must equal the number of negative conclusions. So how do we deal with that? Well, a couple of options. but one would be to obvert the premise and the other would be to obvert the conclusion. So let's do the obversion of the premise. So if we do the obversion of this particular negative, some professor books are not rhetoric books becomes some professor books are non-rhetoric books. Now we have a particular affirmative statement and we've eliminated the fallacy of unequal negation. We can proceed from here and we can look at the middle term, which is non-rhetoric books, and non-rhetoric books here is not distributed because it's predicate of an affirmative, which means when it reappears, it must be in a distributed position because middle terms have to be distributed once and only once. So to figure out where that's going to go, it's got to be in a distributed position, and I know this cannot be a negative missing premise because that would again would give us unequal negation. It has to be an affirmative statement, and then that also tells us it's going to be universal affirmative with the subject term non-rhetoric books because it has to be in the subject position of a universal affirmative because it has to be distributed. So we have a middle term that's distributed now once and only once, and that's fine. Professor books, the first end term, is not distributed in the conclusion. It's not distributed in the first premise. That's equal and fine. But boring books is missing, so that's the missing term in the missing premise. And boring books is not distributed in the conclusion. It's predicate of an affirmative. And if we just move it right up into the predicate position of the universal affirmative, it would also not be distributed, making it equal with its appearance in the conclusion. And then we have a valid syllogism with the missing premise. All non-rhetoric books are boring books. So that's a review of exercise 17, some more syllogisms and a few introductory examples of generating missing premises. Exercise 18 will be all on missing premises. And if you have any questions on either applying the rules of inference to syllogisms or using the rules of inference to generate a missing premise and translating from natural language arguments into standard logical form, please post your questions to the discussion board.
California raisins from the California vineyards. Don't you know I